Part 6, Chapter 2. To classify the dangers they faced in order of magnitude would have been impossible, but of the known threats, the greatest undoubtedly was ice, especially at night. One single collision with an unseen fragment could have ended the journey in a moment. Thus, Shackleton's plan was to get north with all possible speed before turning east toward South Georgia. And for the next 2 days, they were lucky. The wind held steady out of the southwest, much of the time almost at gale force. By noon on April 26th, they had logged a total of 128 miles from Elephant Island without encountering a sign of ice. However, those 2 days were an ordeal during which they were introduced, one at a time, to the endless miseries which constituted life on board the boat. Almost and forever, there was the water, the all-pervading, inescapable water. Sometimes it was just a shower of spray thrown up from the bow and flung astern by the wind, which caused no real suffering except to the man at the helm. Much worse were the quieter, solid seas dipped up by the bow that poured aft and sloshed into the cockpit. And worst of all were the occasions when the boat plunged down just as a wave broke. Then green, foamed water rolled across the decking, splashed into the cockpit, and drained down into the boat, in which icy streams through a score of openings in the canvas decking, as rain might pour through the roof of a dilapidated shack. Within 24 hours after leaving Elephant Island, the decking had begun to sag so that there were a dozen pockets to hold the water. The man at the helm, of course, suffered the most, and each of them took his turn at the yoke lines for an hour and 20 minutes during each watch. But the other 2 men on duty were better off only by comparison. When they weren't bailing or tending the sails or shifting ballast by moving the rocks in the bottom, they spent their time trying to avoid the streams coming from above. It was of little use, though. Invariably, they wound up huddled over with the water pouring off their backs. All of them were dressed more or less the same way. Heavy wool underwear, woolen trousers, a thick, loose sweater with a pair of light gabardine Burberry overalls on the outside. Their heads were covered with knitted, woolen helmets and Burberry outer helmets tucked in at their neck. On their feet, they wore 2 pairs of socks, a pair of ankle-high felt boots, and finskos, reindeer skin boots with their hair side out, though every trace of hair had long since worn off, leaving them bald and limp. There was not a set of oilskins on board. Such clothing was intended for wear in intense, dry cold, not on board a pitching, spray-drenched boat. Here it had an almost wick-like action, soaking up every icy drop until the saturation point was reached, then maintained. The best that could be done was to live with this trial by water, as I had on the trip to Elephant Island, to sit as still as possible after each soaking so as to avoid contact with the newly drenched area of clothing. But to sit motionless in a 22-foot boat in a heavy sea can be difficult indeed. The boat had to be pumped out at a fairly frequent intervals, usually 2 or 3 times each watch, and the job required 2 men, one to operate the plunger while the other held the icy brass cylinder down into the water in the bottom of the boat. Even with mittens, the hands of the man gripping the cylinder would go numb within the space of 5 minutes, and they would trade places. Nor was the discomfort on board limited to the men on watch. They realized from the very beginning that even sleeping had a special brand of unpleasantness all its own. The sleeping bags were located in the bow, nominally the driest part of the boat. To reach them involved a tortuous crawl on hands and knees over the rocks in the bottom. The closer a man got to the bow, the more restricted the space became, until finally he had to get down on his belly and slither forward, insinuating himself between the underside of the seats and the ballast. When at last he had reached the bow, there was the job of getting into his bag, then finally the problem of going to sleep. Fatigue helped, of course, but even so, the action of the boat in the bow was more violent than anywhere else. At times they were heaved bodily upwards, only to fall down onto the rocks again, or perhaps to be slammed from beneath as the boat was pitched aloft by a new wave. The Caird had been equipped with 6 sleeping bags so that each man might have his own, but Shackleton soon suggested that they share 3 bags and use the others as mattresses to protect them from the rocks. Everyone quickly agreed. They discovered, too, that under the decking there was not quite enough room to sit upright. For the first couple of meals, they tried to eat half bent over, with their chins pressed down against their chests, but this position greatly interfered with swallowing, and the only thing to do was to stretch out on the rocks in the bottom. But no matter what position they assumed, sitting, reclining, or lying in their sleeping bags, the struggle against the motion of the boat was ceaseless. The 2,000 pounds of ballast in the bottom gave the Caird a particularly vicious action, and she jerked upright after every wave. Worsley thought she was overballast, and he urged Shackleton to throw some of the rocks overboard. But Shackleton took a characteristically cautious view of the matter. The only way to see if Worsley was right was to dump the ballast, and then it would be gone forever. It was better, Shackleton felt, to put up with the wind-wicked motion of the boat than to risk being light. They had sailed from Elephant Island in rather high spirits, knowing that they were embarked at last for civilization. As McNeish had recorded, wet through, but happy through it all. But after 2 days of uninterrupted misery, their cheeriness had worn away, and by noon on April 26th, after Worsley had fixed the position at 128 miles from Elephant Island, the ordeal to which they were committed had become altogether too real. There was only the consolation that they were making progress at the agonizingly slow rate of about 1 mile every half hour or so. The actual position on April 26 was 59 degrees 46 minutes south, 52 degrees 18 minutes west, and to put the Caird a scant 14 miles north of the 60th parallel of latitude. Thus they had just crept over the line separating the raving 50s and the screaming 60s, so called because of the weather that prevails there. This, then, was the Drake Passage, the most dreaded bit of ocean on the globe, and rightly so. Here, nature has been given a proving ground on which to demonstrate what she can do if left alone. The results are impressive. It begins with the wind. There is an immense area of persistent low pressure in the vicinity of the Antarctic Circle, approximately 67 degrees south latitude. It acts as a giant sump into which high pressure from far north continually drains, accompanied by almost ceaseless gale-force westerly winds. In the prosaic, often studiously understated language of the U.S. Navy's sailing direction for Antarctica, these winds are described categorically. They are often of hurricane intensity and with gust velocities sometimes attaining to 150 to 200 miles per hour. Winds of such violence are not known elsewhere, save perhaps within a tropical cyclone. Also in these latitudes, as nowhere else on Earth, the sea girdles the globe, uninterrupted by any mass of land. Here, since the beginning of time, the winds have mercilessly driven the seas clockwise around the earth to return again to their birthplace, where they reinforce themselves or one another. The waves thus produced have become legendary among seafaring men. They are called Cape Horn rollers or graybeards. Their length has been estimated from crest to exceed a mile, and the terrified reports of some mariners have placed their height at 200 feet, though scientists doubt that they very often exceed 80 or 90 feet. How fast they travel is largely a matter of speculation, but many sailormen have claimed their speed occasionally reaches 55 miles an hour. 30 knots is probably a more accurate figure. Charles Darwin, on first seeing these waves breaking on Tierra del Fuego in 1833, wrote in his diary, The sight is enough to make a landsman dream for a week about death, peril, and shipwreck. As viewed from the Caird, the sight of these rollers constituted ample reason for such thoughts. In the rare moments where the sun shone, they were cobalt blue, which gave them the appearance of being infinitely deep, as indeed they were. But most of the time the sky was overcast, and then the whole surface of the sea turned a somber, lifeless gray. There was no sound to the relentless advance of these cliffs of water except the hiss of their foaming brows when they rose to such a height or charged forward so fast that they lost their balance, and their crests tumbled to the force of gravity. Once every 90 seconds or less, the Caird's sail would go slack as one of these gigantic waves loomed astern, possibly 50 feet above her, and threateningly, surely, to bury her under 100 million tons of water. But then, by some phenomenon of buoyancy, she was lifted higher and higher up the face of the onrushing swell until she found herself, rather unexpectedly, caught in the turmoil of foam at the summit and hurtling forward. Over and over again, 1,000 times each day, this drama was reenacted. Before long, to the men on board the Caird, it lost all elements of awesomeness, and they found it routine and commonplace instead, as a group of people may become inured to the perils of living in the shadow of an active volcano. Only very occasionally did they think about South Georgia. It was so remote, so utopian, that it was almost depressing to contemplate. No man could have endured with just that to keep him going. Instead, life was reckoned in periods of a few hours, or possibly only a few minutes, an endless succession of trials leading to deliverance from the particular hell of the moment. When a man was awakened to go on watch, the focal point of his existence became that time, 4 hours away, when he could slither back into the cold, wet rockiness of the sleeping bag he was now leaving. And within each watch, there were a number of subdivisions, the time at the helm, 80 eonic minutes, during which a man was forced to expose himself to the full wickedness of the spray and the cold, the ordeal of pumping, and the awful task of shifting ballast, and the lesser trials, which lasted perhaps 2 minutes, like the interval after each numbering spray struck until a man's clothes warmed enough so that he could move once more. Again and again the cycle was repeated until the body and the mind arrived at a state of numbness in which the frenzied antics of the boat, the perpetual cold and wet, came to be accepted almost as normal. On April 27th, 3 days out from Elephant Island, their luck turned bad. About noon, a raw and penetrating mist-like rain began to fall, and the wind slowly started to move around toward the north, dead ahead. They were now perhaps 150 miles north of Elephant Island, and still well within the zone where they might encounter ice. Thus, they could not afford to be blown a single mile to the south. Shackleton and Worsley spent several minutes discussing the possibilities, and finally decided there was no choice but to hold the Caird up into the wind as best they could. And so the struggle began, swinging from one tack to the other and taking a wearisome pounding in the process. It was all the more unpleasant because they were simply absorbing punishment while doing nothing more than holding their own. But about 11 p.m., to their great relief, the wind eased down and moved into the northwest. By the time Worsley's watch took over at midnight, they were able to resume the course to the northeast. At dawn on April 28th, only a light northwest breeze was blowing. Actually, it was the best weather they've had since leaving Elephant Island 4 days before. But there were dangerous signs of deterioration, both among the men and in their equipment. Shackleton noticed, with apprehension, that the familiar pains of the sciatica he had suffered at Ocean Camp were coming back, and all of the men were bothered by an increasing sensation of discomfort in their feet and legs, a feeling of tightness. About mid-morning, McNeish suddenly sat down in the center of the cockpit and peeled off his boots. His legs, ankles, and feet were puffy and dead white, apparently from lack of exercise and from being continually soaked. When Shackleton saw the condition of McNeish's feet, he suggested that the other men remove their footgear, and they were all the same. Vincent was in far worse condition, apparently suffering from rheumatism. Shackleton looked in the medicine chest and gave him the only remedy which seemed likely to help, a small bottle of witch hazel. The damage to Worsley's navigational books by the constant soaking was an even more serious problem. The destruction of these books could mean losing their way across this forsaken waste of ocean, and though every effort was made to protect them, they had to be taken out whenever a sight was taken. Both covers of the logarithm book were soggy, and the wet was beginning to spread to the inside pages. The nautical almanac, with its tables of sun and star positions, was in even worse shape. It was printed on cheaper paper and was fast approaching a state of pulpiness. Its pages had to be carefully peeled apart to separate them. In the matter of taking sights, Worsley at first tried bracing himself inside the cockpit, but it was no good. To remain upright was difficult enough. To get an accurate reading was impossible. He found that it was best to kneel on the helmsman's seat, and with Vincent and McCarthy holding him around the waist. Early in the afternoon of April 28th, the relatively good weather from the northwest came to an end as the wind moved slowly to the west and began to freshen. By dusk, it had inched to the south-southwest and risen almost to gale force. Night came on, and an overcast blotted out the stars. The only way to steer was by watching the pennant on the main mast blown out before the wind and holding to a course which kept it pointed just off the port bow. Only once in the night was a positive check on the direction permitted, and then a flaming match was lighted so they can see the compass for a moment to make certain that the wind was still out of the same quadrant. They had only 2 candles which were being strictly preserved for that time that now seemed so far away, the landfall at South Georgia. The dawn of the 5th day, April 29th, rose on a lumpy sea under a dull sky. Low, troubled clouds scudded past, almost touching the surface of the water. The wind was near dead astern, and the Caird labored forward like a protesting old woman, being hurried along faster than she cared to go. Just before noon, a rift appeared in the sky, and Worsley hurriedly got his sextant. He was just in time, for a few minutes later, the sun smiled down for one wintry flicker and then was gone. But Worsley had his sight, and Shackleton had recorded the chronometer reading. When the position was worked out, it put the Caird at 58 degrees 38 minutes south, 58 degrees 0 minutes west. They had covered 238 miles since leaving Elephant Island 6 days before. They were almost 1/3 of the way.